Okay, I will start. Hello and welcome to everyone in what are, to speak euphemistically, interesting and difficult times for so many. My name is Elaine Coburn. I'm a professor at York University and the director of the Center for Feminist Research here in Toronto, Canada. I speak from lands caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and now home to many Indigenous peoples. This acknowledgement comes with responsibilities for the Center for Feminist Research. Part of fulfilling those responsibilities is the 4th year of the Indigenous Women Speaker Series, which in the winter semester will feature 3 separate lectures, one by Professor Margaret Kovach, author of Indigenous Methodologies, the second by Professor J. Keholani Kuawani, author of Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism, and the Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity, and Sharon McIver, who has fought over decades fearlessly and against formidable opposition from the colonial state and from patriarchal Indigenous leaders for the rights of Indigenous women. Today, we turn to struggles on ancestral Lenape homelands in New York City for the book launch of Professor Simon Black's Social Reproduction and the City, Welfare Reform, Childcare, and Resistance in Neoliberal New York. Professor Black will be introduced by distinguished Professor Meg Luxton, whose work is or should be well known to anyone familiar with feminist political economy and social reproduction. Then Professor Black will speak about his book for about 40 minutes, followed by Professor Idil Abdillahi, an expert on anti-Black racism and Black feminist thought, who will open the discussion. We will then open up the session for questions, commentary, and conversation between the audience and the author. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Simon Black, Idil Abdillahi, and now Professor Meg Luxton for her introduction.
Thank you, Elaine, and welcome everyone, and welcome to Simon and Idil. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Simon Black, whose work I have enormous respect for. His research employs a feminist political economy approach to the study of work and labor in urban, national, and transnational contexts. And he explores how race, class, gender, citizenship, migration all shape social reproduction and the organization of paid and unpaid work. He's known for his innovative approaches to labor studies, including research on community unionism, anti-unionism in sport, looking at the CHL, and important work on childcare, particularly pertinent topic right at the moment for all of us. He's currently working with researchers at the Hugh Shearer Labor Studies Institute at the University of the West Indies on a project exploring domestic workers' rights in law and in practice in the wake of Jamaica's ratification of ILO C-189 on decent work for domestic workers. One of his ongoing concerns is community labor relations in the context of neoliberal capitalist state policies, one of the main themes of the book that we're launching today. So with great pleasure, here's the book, and I'll turn it over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Meg, and thank you to Tiffany at the Center for Feminist Research for pulling all of this together, and thank you to Elaine for the invitation. Thank you to Meg for suggesting the idea, the CFR doing a book launch. This is the first launch, the official launch of the book, and I am a York graduate, so it's nice to be back virtually at least. And I'm very pleased to have Professor Idil Abdillahi with us today, whose work I greatly admire. Thank you to Idil. A plug for Idil's book, Black Life, Post-BLM and the Struggle for Freedom, out right now from ARP Books. If you don't have it, you should check it out, definitely. And I'm really honored to be introduced by Meg. I was thinking, when did I first encounter Meg Luxton's work as an undergraduate? And I was able to dig up. I'm one of these people who holds on to my undergraduate research papers in hard copy. And I was able to dig up from Sociology 207, my second year sociology course, Women in Work, a Socialist Feminist Perspective, in which I cite Meg probably too many times, probably for the professor's liking, but he wasn't all that progressive. But yeah, so I've been engaged with Meg's work since as an undergraduate, since being an undergrad at University of Toronto studying sociology. So it is an honor to have Meg introduce me. what a moment to be discussing and thinking through social reproduction with you all. I know we're all probably suffering a little bit from Zoom fatigue. So I do really appreciate you all taking time out of your days to join us today for the book launch. And thank you all for attending. From a feminist political economy perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic and ruling class responses to it bring to light, I think, like few historical moments have, the contradiction, which is always there under capitalism, but it's particularly pronounced now, the contradiction between social reproduction and capital accumulation, or between profit making and life making. In a time of pandemic, the reproduction of individuals, households, and communities in a state of health and well-being, of course, requires massive state investments in care. And yet 40 plus years of neoliberalism has really weakened public health infrastructures and collective care capacities globally. Meg mentioned that I'm doing a little bit of research with scholars at the University of West Indies, and in doing some of the research for looking at the context of domestic workers' struggles there, in Jamaica, the government had adopted, the state had adopted, welcomed the IMF reluctantly in the early 1990s. And since the 1990s, Jamaica has been under one form or another of structural adjustment under the IMF's neoliberal policies. And anywhere between 30 to 50 cents of every tax dollar earned by the government in Jamaica has been going to debt servicing. I mean, that's the lead into this pandemic, in which we have a government which could have been spending money, investing that money in childcare, public health, and crisis and pandemic preparedness, having to pay the bankers and international finance. And that's really across the global South. So the book, without getting too much into the theory, the theoretical weeds, I want to just in my talk kind of give a general sense of the arc of the story that I'm telling in this book. And I'm going to share my screen because I do have a few visuals to go with the talk. So if you'll just give me a second, I'll do that now. And please, if you don't see my screen, please someone let me know, because I've done it wrong then. We're okay, Elaine? Great. So in the early 1990s, New York City became one of the most aggressive jurisdictions in the United States in reducing the welfare rolls and putting poor people, particularly poor mothers, to work, in the sense that the work that they were doing already, the work of caring for their children, the work of domestic work in their households, care work more broadly in communities, was not recognized under welfare reform. Against the backdrop of federal welfare reform, which happened under the Clinton administration, in New York City, thousands of poor single mothers were pushed off of welfare and into workfare programs and into the lower reaches of the labor market, the increasingly low wage and precarious labor market. It was done under the administration. At this point in the talk, you should be throwing things at your screen and booing and hissing, as Rudy Giuliani here, elected in 1993 to be mayor of New York City. It was done under the administration of Rudolph Giuliani. And Giuliani came to power, as I mentioned, in 1993 by defeating New York's first Black mayor, David Dinkins, who had run on a platform of social justice and racial justice. And Giuliani, as socialist feminist scholars in the United States have pointed out, assaults on the welfare state, like in New York City and nationally, assaults on the welfare state and social reproduction always speak a racist and sexist language. Giuliani came to power promising to restore so-called law and order, targeting the racialized poor, what he called the urban underclass, who are mired in a culture of poverty, promising to quote unquote clean up the city, targeting Black and Latino youth, those who had moved into the informal economy, such as those doing survival work like squeegeeing, those who are unhoused or homeless, sex workers, and promising the middle class, the disproportionately white middle class of New York, that he was going to improve their quality of life. And we saw in this period a massive expansion of policing in New York City and aggressive policing practices that were premised on the faulty theory of so-called broken windows theory of crime, which was really a way in which crime was framed that allowed the police to target, in particular, poor racialized communities, and to, in many ways, to Giuliani unleashed the brutality and violence. Not that they weren't brutal and violent before, but gave permission for the New York Police Department to be acting and behaving and policing in ways that at least a progressive Democratic mayor such as David Dinkins tried to put a check on. Giuliani also promised to end welfare, and he promised to end welfare prior to Bill Clinton promising to, quote unquote, end welfare as we know it. And he did that by, in his promises to end welfare, as he campaigned and as he governed in his first years in office, he promised to end welfare using racially coded rhetoric and dog whistles, always speaking of the welfare queen, dependency, the need to rebuild the work ethic, and to rebuild the nuclear family. Despite a majority of welfare recipients in the United States, nationally always being white women, as Black feminist scholars such as Dorothy Roberts or Juanima Lubiano have pointed out, racist and sexist tropes such as the Black welfare queen are really the cover story for reducing government provision for social reproduction in general and cutting welfare state and vital supports for households and communities. So that was the political context in which the question was asked by policymakers in New York. If we are to push poor women on welfare into the lower reaches of the labor market, into workfare programs, who would, and this is the question that they asked in the New York Times, in the Daily News, the question that policymakers and childcare advocates and welfare rights activists all asked at the time, who would care for these mothers' children? Now, in contrast to some of the more general accounts of welfare reform in the United States, and particularly the national politics of welfare reform, the answer to the question of how poor mothers' childcare needs would be met, by whom, under what conditions, and to what effect, in New York was fiercely contested. Over a span of 15 years, this question was subject to intense social and political struggles, which pit childcare advocates, welfare rights activists, activist mothers, legal aid lawyers, low-income community groups, and public sector unions against first the Giuliani administration, but later the Bloomberg administrations, and their commitment to a neoliberal logic of providing childcare on the cheap. It's this struggle, this 15-year struggle, that I've documented and attempt to analyze using a feminist political economy perspective in the book. But I also situate this struggle in a kind of long historical context of working class women's struggles over the value of their care work and over social reproduction more broadly in New York City. Why New York City? Well, New York City was symbolic of a number of things when it came to welfare and welfare reform in the United States. One, the city's welfare caseload at the time of the early 1990s was actually bigger than any other caseload of any state, bar California. So that's just the city's welfare caseload, the number of welfare recipients. Giuliani rolls out welfare to work programs, his aggressive welfare reform agenda, a year prior to the passage of Bill Clinton's federal welfare reform. And in New York City, along with the state of Wisconsin, workfare, especially placing welfare recipients in public sector jobs in return for their benefits, was really pioneered in New York City. New York City was also the symbolic home of the national welfare rights movement and remained a center of anti-poverty activism and welfare rights advocacy. In the rights war on welfare, there was perhaps no battleground more important than New York City. And because of its relatively generous welfare benefits, strong unions, public services, and the degree to which the city had, at least since the 1930s and then in the 1960s, with the expansion of the American welfare state, the city had underwrote social reproduction through an extensive municipal welfare state. And for that reason, conservatives, of course, hated New York City. I don't know if anybody's seen this movie, but it's awful. Don't go looking for it anytime soon. But Moscow on the Hudson, this is what conservatives like to call New York. Moscow on the Hudson. This is how hysterical the rhetoric was about New York City and the welfare benefits and a degree to which it underwrote social reproduction more generally through a municipal university system, through cheap and easy to use mass transit, through extensive affordable housing, social housing, and cooperatives, and through the provision of childcare that conservatives targeted for reform. So despite neoliberal restructuring, which really began in New York in the midst of the 1975 fiscal crisis, the political culture of New York's, what Joshua Freeman has called social democratic polity, or social democracy in one city, had remained by the early 1990s. And in New York City, the location of childcare, the conditions of those who provide it, and the value accorded this work have been the subject of a long history of struggle in the city. New York City, as I mentioned, was the epicenter of the welfare rights movement. Thousands of poor African American and Puerto Rican New Yorkers, primarily single mothers, had mobilized in the 1960s and 1970s to demand state support for the work of raising and caring for their children. The militancy of this movement in New York City meant that for a short time, really from the late 60s to the mid 1970s, many of the city's poor single mothers could stay at home and care for their children and live at levels not worse than low-wage workers. In the 1930s, in the New Deal, the LaGuardia administration had established public day nurseries with federal aid, creating jobs for unemployed teachers and providing care for children whose parents were out looking for work. When women entered the war industries in the late 1940s, the question of who would care for their children was answered by the expansion of these New Deal day nurseries or daycares. And when the state government attempted to shut down the city's nascent childcare system at war's end, poor and working class women, both Black and white, socialists and communists and liberals, resisted. And New York City became the first local government in the nation to fund and provide childcare services after the war. When these services expanded in the 1960s as part of the federal government's war on poverty and the response to the federal response to urban uprisings of poor and working class Black people, daycare workers on whose labor these services rested formed a union and went out on strike. They became Local 205, the Daycare Employees Union, became the first childcare workforce in the United States to form a union. And they would go on to set the bar for wages and working conditions in the childcare sector for years to come. In the early 1970s, here's an image of the first Women's Day March down Fifth Avenue in August 26, 1970, with a sign there, Women Demand Daycare. In the 1970s, the parents, community organizers, and trade unionists who made up New York City's childcare movement ambitiously pushed for universal, high-quality, municipally funded daycare in the wake of President Nixon's veto of universal childcare legislation, the closest the United States has come in the early 1970s and 1971 to passing national legislation that would provide universal childcare. So when Nixon vetoed that legislation, Women, daycare workers, and mothers and trade unionists organized in New York to demand that New York City provide universally, municipally delivered universal childcare. In the mid-1970s, when the city's fiscal crisis hit, this daycare movement took to the streets to defend childcare services. As fire stations and other city services were being cut or shut down, women took to the streets, occupied places like the Triborough Bridge in New York City, and demanded that daycare centers, the city's daycare centers, be spared from the austerity and the cuts. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration, waging its war on the poor and urban liberalism, cut federal aid to cities like New York and orchestrated the privatization of many municipal services from above. In New York City, under the pressure from daycare workers' unions, parents, and childcare advocates, the city actually held fast to its role in the delivery, funding, and regulation of childcare. When the remnants of the 1960s childcare that was funded in cities across the United States was dwindled and or privatized, even in progressive cities like San Francisco. New York, because of the strength of the daycare movement, the childcare movement there, held fast to its role in the delivery, funding, and regulation of childcare. So by the time of welfare reform in the early 1990s, the question of who would care for the children of women transitioning from welfare into workfare or the labor market was, the answer to that question was one that welfare rights activists and childcare advocates said was the nation's most comprehensive, publicly funded, center-based childcare system. Now, of course, for neoliberal and neoconservative politicians like Rudolph Giuliani and later Michael Bloomberg, they had a very different answer to that question. Since the city's neoliberal turn in the 1970s, New York had experimented in different ways with getting public service work done cheaply, whether it was contracting out services to the private sector, encouraging volunteering, getting welfare recipients to do public sector work previously done by unionized city workers, and generally offloading costs and responsibilities for caregiving to families and communities. As social spending was cut and welfare services privatized, it was, of course, poor and working class women who took up the social reproductive slack at home and in the community. And it was disproportionately women, and particularly women of color, whose union jobs in home care, in child care, in community health care, and other social services that were on the line. So how the city solved the heightened childcare crisis in the early 1990s in the wake of welfare reform, how they answered the question of who would care for the children, was not the way childcare advocates, welfare rights activists, and poor racialized communities would want them to answer that. It was the expansion of the city's longstanding childcare system, publicly funded childcare system. Instead, the Giuliani administration set about channeling women on welfare into reliance on an expanding pool of home-based childcare providers for the care of their children. Home-based childcare providers were, like women on social assistance or on welfare, disproportionately working class women of color. You see here a cartoon. It was published around in 2002 by a great political cartoonist by the name of Dan Wasserman in the Boston Globe. And it really sums up, and I think if I didn't write a book and I just wrote a cartoon or did a graphic novel about this instead, I would have to do a cartoon like this, because I think it's a very succinct summary of what what conservatives' welfare reform plan was, and how they were going to answer this question of who would care for the children. Here we see another cartoon from Dan Wasserman. the welfare administrator there asking, you are a bad mother, and the mother responding, why? And he responds, you hang around the house taking care of the kids. We'll cut you off of welfare if you don't take a job. And the mother replies, doing what? And the administrator replies, taking care of someone else's kids. So we see with the expansion of home-based childcare, rather than mothers looking after and caring for their own children, the responsibilities for childcare were shifted to friends, to neighbors, to aunts, to grandmothers, and in some cases to home-based childcare providers who had set up what were essentially small businesses in their homes. Home-based, or what's called family daycare in the United States, in which they would accept anywhere between 3 to 12 children in their homes, which were essentially like lightly regulated, and they would be paid through childcare subsidies and are paid through childcare subsidies from the state. So a woman on welfare would receive a voucher. They would then use this voucher for care, and the care provider would be paid by the city through state subsidies. Now, under federal and state law, women on welfare had a choice of childcare options, including regulated center-based care or unregulated informal care. But the Giuliani administration did not respect those choices that were in federal legislation and state legislation. The administration in its early years set about closing city-funded childcare centers, expanding the childcare voucher scheme, essentially marketizing and privatizing childcare, and reducing the supply of quality, affordable care in some of New York City's poorest neighborhoods. As for women on welfare, who were expected to be presented with these choices when they spoke to their caseworker, I think this little synopsis of the experience of mothers in New York City's welfare offices that was published in the New York Times in the late 1990s really sums up their experiences. And I'm just going to quote from this New York Times investigative report into the experiences with childcare that poor women on welfare had in New York City. In the Bronx, a city caseworker searching for licensed babysitters finds only 6 names in her computer, and all 6 have let their certification expire. She prints the useless list for a welfare mother with worried eyes and says, "You'll just have to do the best you can." In Brooklyn, a harried caseworker refuses to hunt for openings, offering her welfare clients an outdated childcare directory instead. But of the providers listed in Brownsville and Brooklyn, where nearly 900 children need care, the only 2 available centers have room for 15 children. And in Queens, a caseworker nods impatiently as a nervous mother ticks off the 12 places she has called, none of which would watch or could watch her baby son. But instead of excusing the mother from workfare, the caseworker leans across his desk and threatens her, slowly and deliberately, and in violation of state law. "They're going to reduce your benefits if you can't find anyone," says the worker Anthony Sweeney. "Can you survive on less money? No? Well, you have to find somebody, a neighbor, a friend, somebody. You have 10 days or you're cut off. No more excuses." So while under state and federal law, welfare recipients in theory had a choice of childcare options, the reality was these choices were foreclosed by the policies of the Giuliani administration in the city of New York. While some mothers preferred home-based childcare arrangements or leaving their children in the care of relatives, a grandmother or aunt, many did not. And the neoliberal discourse of choice in New York really hit the hand of a coercive disciplinary workforce state. For the city, of course, home-based childcare was the fastest and most effective route to moving poor mothers off the welfare rolls. Performing public care work while hidden inside the so-called private sphere of the home, home-based childcare providers were excluded from key employment protections, and labor rights. They were paid sub-minimum wages for the care of poor children, and they didn't have a union, unlike center-based care workers, daycare workers. They didn't have a union to advance their collective interests. In effect, these women provided childcare on the cheap. The idea, of course, that there was no alternatives was false. The city could have expanded, the city could have expanded its center-based system, its unionized center-based system. But I think we have to understand the developments in New York within a broader project of urban neoliberalization. Sweeping privatization, the delivery of municipal services by non-union labor, the downloading of costs and responsibilities for social reproduction onto households, and particularly the women within them, through cuts, user fees, vouchers, and so on. The Giuliani administrations have always pleaded poor when it came to childcare, but they gave tax breaks to developers and the super rich and oversaw a significant expansion of the city's police force. Poor mothers struggled to find stable, quality childcare arrangements, and women working as childcare providers struggled to earn a decent living, while the city's police force was expanded and funded to the hilt. But while there's restructuring, there's always resistance, and childcare advocates in New York City demanded and lobbied the city to ensure that there was real choice in childcare. They documented the violation of state and federal law that happened in welfare offices and tried to publicly shame the city into respecting welfare mothers' rights to choose childcare, the childcare setting that they wanted. Welfare rights groups set up guerrilla daycare centers in the lobby of the Welfare Administration, occupying welfare offices, handing out skipping ropes to children and balls for them to play with, effectively shutting down welfare offices and the Welfare Administration's main office in Manhattan. Unions attempted to establish home childcare programs in which mothers who were transitioning off of welfare could study for accreditation as early childhood educators and could set up a home daycare and also join the union which had established this training program. And then there was community organizing. Groups like Families United for Racial and Economic Equality in Brooklyn brought together African American and Puerto Rican mothers in the city's welfare program and daycare providers, bringing them together to break bread, to talk about the disrespect they experience at the hands of the city's welfare officials and at the hands of the city officials who oversaw childcare. They came together with common cause in a stable quality childcare system, or in stable quality childcare. Stable and quality care meaning decent wages and benefits for providers as well. Collectively, they built power to demand respect and investment in childcare. And in the mid to late 1990s, they organized numerous campaigns to demand investment, city investment, municipal investment in the city's childcare system and the provision of affordable quality childcare. These community organizing efforts, as I discuss in the chapter on resistance in the book, these community organizing efforts were led not only by groups like Fury, Families United for Racial and Economic Equality, but also community organizers with the group ACORN, and later they were joined by the United Federation of Teachers. They set about a campaign to organize, to unionize this home childcare workforce, which numbered by the late 1990s 28,000 childcare providers. They set on a contradiction which was at the heart of the city's strategy to provide childcare on the cheap. Many women who had provided childcare kind of as private pay providers were now receiving state subsidies for the care of children of poor mothers who had entered the labor market. Well, these providers really emerged as a kind of quasi public sector workforce, performing the care work of a neoliberalizing welfare state. by subsidizing home childcare, by using state monies for home-based childcare, this opened the legal and discursive space to organize home childcare providers to form a union and to make claims on the state as public employees, just like center-based daycare workers who were providing an essential service, who were deserving of better wages and working conditions, and access to training and to professional development, and really to have a voice in childcare policy. Home-based providers and eventually the United Federation of Teachers, which set about organizing home-based providers into a union, they looked to Illinois, where home care providers, both home health care and home child care providers, had pressured a Democratic governor to make home care providers employees of the state for the purposes of collective bargaining. And by 2010, 28,000 home child care providers in New York City had formed a union, and they went on to collectively bargain with the city and the state to improve wages, to provide access, to win benefits, and to win collective voice in childcare policy. In the tradition of the city's welfare rights movement and the tradition of its unionized daycare workers, home childcare providers and their allies fought to revalue poor and working class women's social reproductive labor. Poor working class women and their allies, I think as this case study demonstrates, really maintain the capacity, despite the near hegemonic processes of neoliberal urbanization, of neoliberalism more broadly, really maintain the capacity to shape urban welfare regimes, to shape social policy, to shape childcare, and the politics of social reproduction from below. And the kind of latest story, or the latest chapter in this story, is that just this summer, in July 2020, 45,000 home-based childcare providers in the state of California have unionized and won the largest union election in that state in decades. So there are 12 states now in the United States that allow for childcare providers to form unions as public, home childcare providers to form unions as public employees, and 12 states in which those unions, despite conservative attacks on public sector unions, those unions remain strong. And on that note, I'll turn it back to Meg. Thank you. Unshare my screen.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think actually I'm going to just very briefly invite your colleague, Professor Idil Abdillahi, to say a few words about, or just open up the conversation, I think was how you wanted to approach it. So I invite you to open up the conversation for the rest of us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simon. It was wonderful. It was so interesting and difficult and hopeful at the same time.
Thank you so much, Simon. And thank you all for having me here as well. I'm really excited to sort of talk about and further generate ideas regarding your book, particularly because as I'm sort of trying to finish up my own dissertation, which looks at some of these issues, I kind of wanted to bring up sort of five critical points that were points of connection for my work, which focuses on the experiences of Black women, who are receiving Ontario works here in Toronto, and their experiences of surveillance in particular, and more recently sort of thinking that through in the context of like technologies that have been deployed against Black women specifically who are on welfare. So I'm really thankful for your text, and in particular with the generosity that you offered in it. You sort of begin by talking about the story of Tasha and Beverly in your book. That is the story of so many women who interact with the state. And in particular, your book really kind of brought home for me the idea of really thinking about how it is that we can think through, or as you put it, sort of scale within how we can think through urban scaling in the context of like feminist political economy and what that means, and how your work has particularly done that. So in the moment of you kind of reading through and doing your research in New York, a lot of what I was thinking about was what was happening here in Toronto in that same time around welfare reform, particularly in the Harris era. Particularly, I'm Somali, and so in thinking about what the process of immigration was for folks who were choosing to come here, one of those things being that there was a particular kind of social safety net within the Canadian context, particularly here in Ontario, whether that was family benefit originally or otherwise. But then the way that that ends up sort of becoming redeployed against these very kinds of communities. And as I revisited sort of my research, part of what I also thought about is how neoliberalism works globally to also really invite people to Canada in a particular way under false pretenses, and in thinking through sort of ideas of like transnational feminism, and how I've even come to engage the population who I was doing work with, was sort of having to push myself even sort of beyond this narrow scope, insofar as I never thought about the question, like in my research, I never actually sat with the question about why many women had come here with their families and with their children, fleeing, in some cases, war-torn Somalia or Ethiopia or Eritrea or other kinds of places. So your work really kind of made me think about neoliberalism, certainly within the North American context, but also what happens outside of that. And in my work with women, thinking about like, what was it that brought you here? And then another point also is just the ways in which sort of social policy in particular uses women and uses race and uses ability and disability as an alibi in many ways, or other kinds of interventions, or neoliberal kinds of interventions as alibis for this other kind of language. And in your text, you really kind of talk about that in a way I think that is really interesting, and also really sort of is pointing our attention to in what ways do we need to think about policy analysis and policy development, in what ways do we need to think about rereading these things from a different kind of perspective, and a perspective that also isn't, certainly we can say things are intersectional, but what happens when, because neoliberalism, like everything else, is sort of keeping up to speed with language and discourse, how do we always guard against that in being able to really read into things and sort of read into gender and race in policy text in a more nuanced way. And I thought that was really interesting in terms of how you had taken that up in the text. In the context of childcare, and in particular around sort of social reproduction, I think one of the other things that it made me think of in relation to my own work and my own research are really the ways in which, in both in your book and also in the way that women have shared their experiences with me, are the ways in which mothering is always really kind of problematized for particular kinds of communities, right? And the ways in which then we don't necessarily think about issues of childcare in relation to working class women, in relation to racialized women, in relation to Black women, largely because we don't necessarily, in some cases, see the children that they have as producing citizens, right? In general, we don't see children as citizens, and so there are ways that we don't have political commitments towards young people in a lot of ways, and children in a lot of ways. But how does race act as an additional mitigating factor around how we treat women in the context of, as you were talking about, social reproduction in relationship to the state, and so forth. And really interestingly, I also think about how, again, this, I was away from my work for a really long time, and really revisiting it and really reading in the ways that I noticed race and Blackness in particular ways, like 4 years and 5 years ago, and then in rereading what was also happening was a way I kind of really absented Islamophobia in a kind of way that also was about me being able to like re-grapple with also state interventions that intersect at other points that I might have not even read into, even though I'm Muslim and Black at the same time, right? So just again, a kind of vigilance around what it is that I'm assuming to read into text and onto text, what I may not even be thinking about, but also the ways in which experiences sometimes are so nuanced that we may not read particular things in a certain way. So I think I thought a lot about that as well. Really interestingly, just sort of pivoting towards labor a bit, quite similarly, a lot of women here in Ontario, particularly here in Toronto, were told to engage in volunteerism, quite similarly to the ways that women in New York that you describe in your book were as well, except what's really interesting in the Canadian context is often that did not result in like sort of any kind of financial reward, but rather additional money, for example, only to buy a bus pass, which would then mean that you can continue looking for work. But also the ways in which volunteerism does serve sort of a space to sort of bridge the neoliberal gap in the labor market that is done by working class people, in my case, working class Black women on welfare, but ultimately the ways in which those jobs never turn into good jobs, never turn into sort of, you know, unionized jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also the ways that we don't see that type of volunteer work as meaningful kinds of work, which sort of leads me to just think about the ways in general that we value racialized people's labor within the labor market. Again, look in the time of COVID, right? Who's doing the work? Who are the folks in which we didn't give medical licenses to before, but we're certainly happy to go have them work in the context of a pandemic. So just kind of making some of these kinds of links. And I think the last piece, which is really interesting, that I'm still sort of working through, and we've been talking about this sort of offline, but are really the ways in which we can make links between technological databases that observe and monitor poor people, in particular women, how those technological systems are interconnected with other kinds of systems. And if we look at sort of the histories of technology, surveillance, and women in particular, the links that we can make to other kinds of technological practices that are being exercised on folks today. So for example, things like carding, you talk about in your book, the experiences of surveillance by way of the welfare queen, et cetera. And again, one of the pieces of sort of the stories that's missing within this context are the experiences of how, by virtue of being poor, many women have had access, or many women have had to interact with the criminal justice system. And there's lots of sort of data that speaks to that, even within the Canadian context, certainly looking around issues of eligibility and so forth. But really thinking that through, and just, you talked a lot about caseworkers, again, sort of thinking about the ways in which the experiences of women are documented in ways that, again, consistently make them precarious in very unique ways because of their gender, right? You know, whether it was, you know, women talking about, for example, having child welfare called on them, or if they have a partner and they were living in like a cooperative housing unit that was for women, having a welfare worker tell the co-op about what that experience was, or so forth like that. I think the only other, I know I said 5, but I think I was doing point and then sub-point, so my bad. But I think the last thing that I'm still grappling with sort of through your text and through your book is, I think I always continue to grapple with the relationship between the labor movements and women, labor movements and racialized women, labor movements and women, Black women, labor movements and women who are queer, trans, living with disabilities, et cetera, and still recognize that there are like a number of ways in which labor cannot resolve out some of these things. And so in sort of just trying to hold some of these tensions still in the context of that work, but also still obviously recognizing that what your intervention is essentially highlighting is the ways in which labor and good work, good jobs, can also act as sites of possibility and resistance, right? So those were some of the thoughts that I, main kind of points I wanted to speak to from your from your text. So I just maybe want to invite you if there's anything that you want to say more about or ask me more about, because I said it to you before and forgot it now, then that's good too.
No, I think that thank you for that, Idil. I mean, it's a deep engagement with the work, and I appreciate it. I know in your own work on um, women, Black women in particular's experience with Ontario Works, that you have an interest in thinking through the ways kind of data collection and kind of new technologies around data are deployed as to police Black women on social assistance. And I think what we saw in New York City, and which I didn't mention, part of the updating of both the welfare system and the updating of policing, or what they called modernization in New York City, was the modernizing of data collection and the ways in which I think we speak of policing as formal policing, you know, the police force, but the ways in which that data collection and technology is deployed to police poor women on welfare as well in New York City became quite apparent, and it's something that I don't think I adequately addressed in the book. But I'd be interesting to hear from you, you know, what kind of connections are you making in your work between formal policing, like police forces and municipal police departments, and how they deploy technology and data collection, like carding in Toronto, and then how that links to policing in the welfare system.
Wow, that's like a really great question, Simon. So I guess a few things. So in the Toronto context, I think it's really important to talk about the same consulting group that sort of created the framework and platform for the social service delivery model in the 90s is the same sort of group that has created the community case notes that come as a result of carding. And so a large part of what this sort of system platform is that obviously it talks about ways to increase efficiencies, etc. But these sort of interconnected systems were also created originally in the 90s in order to ensure that people were not sort of engaging in fraud, right? And that people were able to, if they showed up at any office, sort of be asked questions about what that experience was. And so I think that when we talk about what these connections are, I think what I'm asking people to think about is the idea of like platform capitalism and the ways that, you know, platform capitalism have direct implications, not just on marginalized people in the context of carding and policing in that way, but one I want to point people to that it was quite frankly, poor folks and often women that were being documented using the SDM's first original 1999 and 2001 rollout. I think that's something that most people aren't aware of. And then I think the second thing around the platform is ultimately the ways in which it was connected to, at that particular moment, housing and other kinds of systems. And so if we not, you know, I think it's important to think about how these systems are duplicated. And now, if we think about the conversations around sort of hyper-surveillance and policing, there's a way in which the experiences of women are absented, right? And so I'm also thinking about that as well, is that we're not necessarily looking towards what other connections can be built by understanding this particular platform, but then also now in terms of responding to for example, carding, responding to over-policing, responding to all of these things, women continue to be an add-on in that particular conversation. And so I think that's a part of why I think it's important to make that connection, as well as I think, again, to point people to things like the WRFT, I think it's called, report that really spoke to the experiences of and criminalized racialized women, right? That and that was a public document and like a policy document. So that's something that I think about. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. That's why I think when we call to defund the police, we also mean welfare caseworkers. We're calling to defund policing, not just not just
Yeah.
not just the police.
Well, absolutely. And I think that like a large part of what I think both you're pointing us to and what I want us to point to, obviously, like what we know is sort of, for me, there are ways that the instruments of surveillance are oftentimes not even thought through as important as the experiences of surveillance. And sometimes those instruments of surveillance, like described in, described by my research participants and the women, were often that they're unscripted, but they knew what they were, right? They knew what these kind of functions were. They knew what these experiences were, even though they were never written down anywhere. They were still held accountable for these kinds of experiences, right? So I think absolutely, the caseworker is also an issue, but the apparatuses are also an issue, right? The tools that make it easy for people to surveil women, to know whether or not they picked up their kid on time, to know, right? All these kinds of things. We also have to turn our kind of attention to these kinds of technologies, and the capital and power that's attached to them, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if if questions from the audience. Again, you can participate either by raising your hand, or showing some sign, or if you'd like to ask a question through the chat function, we can read it out loud so that either Simon or Idil may respond.
I think maybe, Simon, while people are thinking about whether or not they'd like to ask a question, sort of in this moment that we're in right now, you talk about resistance in the book. And so I'm wondering if we can just take a minute to kind of collectively think through what resistance would mean in this particular time, when we know that it is individuals who are doing gendered labor, working class people, racialized people, who are the ones who are also experiencing a particular brunt of COVID at this time, people that are dying, people that are still on the front lines. And so what does resistance actually look like and actually mean during a moment that people are just trying to survive?
I think that's a question I'd like everybody to kind of chime in on. I mean, we're at a time where we're seeing heightening struggles over social reproduction and its various manifestations, right? Over the ability to reproduce themselves and communities to reproduce themselves in households on a daily and intergenerational basis. And I think from PSWs refusing to go into work in long-term care without proper PPE, to calls to even the calls, as you mentioned, calls to defund the police, which some don't think of as struggles over social reproduction, but the struggles for communities to be safe from police violence is fundamentally a struggle over social reproduction, and we need to think of it as such. The struggles of so-called essential workers who are doing social reproductive labor, who were given kind of pandemic pay, and now as the economy supposedly it reopens, that pandemic pay has been withdrawn. So we have a moment through lockdown in which we temporarily valued, our state temporarily valued or put greater value on the work of social reproductive labor, paid social reproductive labor. And then that value, of course, has been, as quickly as that work has been valued, it's been devalued as the economy, quote unquote, reopens, and as the capital accumulation is once again prioritized and the economy is no longer under lockdown. So I think these struggles and thinking through these struggles and making connections is really the stuff of social movements and good organizing, and we have to continue to do that in our communities. So, yeah.
So maybe I'll invite folks again to, if they'd like to ask a question or if they'd like to put up their hand if they have something that they'd like to share, a question for Simon, a reflection.
And I'm seeing people I know here on this call, so don't make me start calling out names. And but thank you all for joining.
Okay, so is there a question? Do you see there, Simon?
No, but I do. I'm just looking it through the participants, and I'm wondering. Not to put her on the spot, but I'm wondering, Maud Perrier, who was a visiting professor at the Center for Feminist Research just recently, and someone I've been in touch with in talking through online, through email, through some of the struggles around social reproduction, around childcare in the UK and elsewhere and in Australia. If Maud would like to share some of her insights around organizing around childcare in the context of the pandemic.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. And congratulations on the book, and good evening, everyone from Bristol. I mean, I actually had a question about the book, about intergenerational relationships, because that's something that I've been concerned with in my work, about how in studying sort of anti-poverty and anti-racist struggles led by single mothers in Bristol, how that knowledge is passed on, and I think that's something that comes across in your work in New York, about the sort of successive waves of organizing. So yeah, I wondered if you could say something about that, about whether you think the specificity of what's happening in New York even today can be sort of partly explained by the not just the sort of strength of those struggles going as far as the 1930s, but how those movements were able to survive over time because of that transgenerational knowledge production.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Maud. Thank you for asking. And when you look at this campaign of 28,000 home-based childcare providers to unionize, someone asked me a question when I started doing the research: is, did these women think of themselves as workers, or did they think of themselves as for those who were not kith and kin, those who had set up family daycares, did they think of themselves as small business owners or entrepreneurs? And some research on home daycare or home childcare across the US does suggest that a lot of family daycare, home daycare providers do think of themselves as small business owners, but that doesn't mean they don't think of themselves also as childcare providers who should have the right to join a union and should have all the protections that come with unionization. But in the case of New York City, I mean, how home-based childcare providers thought of themselves both as kith and kin providing care, if that was the case, if they were aunts or grandmothers, but also if they were family daycare providers as kind of small business owners. It was often the case that they might have had a mother or a grandmother who had worked in childcare in the city, who had been a member of Local 205 of the Daycare Employees Union in New York, had been central to the struggles of daycare workers in center-based daycare to unionize, to become the first unionized workforce of childcare providers in the United States. And if it wasn't a mother or a grandmother, it was people in their community that had those connections that could say to them then, you know, don't think of yourself solely as a small business owner or as an aunt or a sister who's providing childcare for, providing childcare to a child whose mother needs it, has been forced by welfare reform to engage in low wage work or into work for a program. Think of yourself as someone who could be unionized as well, someone who needs the protection of a union. And I think that kind of intergenerational, both at community and familial levels, that intergenerational sharing of knowledge, of struggle, of organizing, and just the spirit of kind of working class resistance was something that shaped how home-based childcare providers thought about the work and thought about the possibilities of resistance as well.
I think there's a raised hand from Brooke.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I was listening to the presentation on my phone, and I finally just got home and got on my computer, so I feel like I can contribute here. But one thing I wanted to bring up was really interesting listening to because I work as a childcare researcher in Canada, and have studied the federal and provincial childcare policy development. So it's really interesting to hear the parallels in New York. I don't know a lot about the States and how it's actually rolled out. I had no idea that home childcare providers had actually established a union in the States, which is really interesting. But one thing I was just wondering about, or that kind of was peripheral in the conversation, which I feel like is an important piece, is there's been this trend towards the professionalization of the workforce, of course, right? The early childhood educators. And there's kind of this unresolved, it's ongoing, this tension between the systemic devaluation of social reproductive labor and care, and then this push towards the increasing professional expectations of highly gendered early childhood educators. So I'm just sort of putting that out there. And what a lot of the work that I've done recently has been focusing on kind of moving beyond the lens of social reproduction to think more critically about, ethical care experiences. And I think just how that's not necessarily addressed or recognized or grappled with. So I don't know, I just kind of wanted to at least bring some attention to the early childhood educators.
Thanks for that, Brooke. And in New York, I know there's some tension in the Canadian childcare movement between professionalization and unionization as a strategy, right, to improve childcare, to raise wages and working conditions in the sector. In New York, when the United Federation of Teachers, which is the teachers union, but also represents paraprofessionals in New York City's public school system, when they set about organizing home-based childcare providers, one of the kind of incentives they used for home-based providers to join the union was access to professional training and access to professional development and further training. So there was a concerted effort by the union and by the childcare movement in New York to think about organizing home-based childcare as a way of raising standards and the quality of care in the sector. And when the union first started reaching out to home-based providers, they said, we recognize you need to join the UFT, the teachers union, because you are the first teachers. You're the first teachers that these children are coming into contact with. So they brought them into the union as teachers, as early childhood educators, even though very few of the women had any a professional accreditation or had they had experience providing childcare. but no professional or formal education or accreditation.
That's really interesting because here we have, like, there's such a professionalization gap, and I would actually say that the professionalization and the unions are against each other. They don't work in tangent with each other. Unions, it's kind of seen as a labor workforce, and then professionals are kind of a different thing. And in Ontario, of course, we have the College of Early Childhood Educators, which adds a whole nother level of complexity onto it. But it makes a lot of sense, obviously, that when it's just interesting when you say the wages and working conditions and how the professionalization go together. It's just so not the case here. It's actually the opposite. Yeah.
There's actually another question from Jana Klosterman. She would like to speak, or they would like to speak.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I really enjoyed the first couple chapters of your book. A friend sent that, and then I had to rewrite the feminist political economy section of my dissertation because you had such and was quoting you because it's so beautifully written. But my one question, I wondered, could you share more about what looking at a city opened up? It seemed like you weren't just adding childcare in the city or adding in the city to the end of a sentence, but taking an urban lens or an urban kind of as a line or level of analysis. And I wondered if you could share more about that or what that entailed.
Yeah, thanks, Yana, and thanks for that compliment as well. The city as a kind of lens, as the city and the urban as lenses through which to understand these struggles, is something I foreground in the theory chapter, and not so much in the presentation today. But I think we have to see it, what these examples of struggles around welfare rights, struggles around municipal provision of daycare, demonstrate is that kind of women's struggles over social reproduction shape the city, shape its social infrastructure, shape the urban welfare regime, the way that mix of families, markets, state, nonprofit sectors provides for or doesn't provide for general welfare, and shapes national and state policies really from below. And it's in struggles in the urban context, for various reasons that we see it struggles in and through the urban context, that we see the shaping of the politics of social reproduction often at national levels from below as well. So I think that's something I wanted to highlight. And I also wanted to highlight the ways in which the restructuring of national welfare states in the context of neoliberalism has led to the rescaling and the downloading of the provision of social services to the urban level, to municipal governments, which often don't have the capacities, at least in the Canadian case, where they don't have the power of kind of taxation in terms of raising income taxes or other forms of taxes beyond the municipal tax base. The way that restructuring and rescaling has led to, rising care crises in the urban context as municipal services are cut, are privatized, and as the costs and responsibilities for social reproduction are offloaded into to households, to communities, and the women within them.
Oh yeah, beautifully put. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next, Meg Luxton had a question or comment.
A question, really, and it sort of follows from Brooks. Toward the end of the book, you talk about the more recent mayor in New York extending free full-day childcare through the school system, and a promise that it will be extended to 3-year-olds. So the first question is whether that it was going to happen in 2020. He's got a month left. Has it happened? And the second question, the more interesting question, is here there was a huge debate at one point about whether or not the fight for early childhood education should be to get it into the school system or to keep it quite distinct. And I wondered what your thoughts are on the relative worth of either option.
Sorry, Meg, I'm going to ask you to repeat just that last question. My you froze on my screen and
there was a debate here about whether it was better to fight for an extension of education in the school system to younger ages, or to keep early childhood education separate as a childcare phenomena. And I wonder what your opinion is, given the work you've been doing. That question clear?
Yeah. So I think the integration of, in the first question, Bill de Blasio, one of his main campaign commitments was to introduce universal pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds, and then to extend that down to 3-year-olds. And this has actually led to many home childcare providers losing their kids to the formal public school system. So even though they've unionized, they've raised wages and working conditions in that sector, now the state's commitment to socialize care through the public school system has actually led many family daycares to be experiencing financial hardship, or to shutting down, or to moving to the provision of care for even younger children, for infants and toddlers, for which there's no place in the pre-K system in the public school system in New York. So I think that's a kind of contradiction at work. It's a funny contradiction, because both home childcare providers and the pre-K teachers are represented by the United Federation of Teachers, by the teachers union. So the provision of early childhood education and care through the school system or through community-based settings, I know that I think I need to read more about the history of kind of community-based or community-controlled childcare, especially in the 1960s and 70s, in the context of places like Toronto and of New York. I think there was a and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense in terms of politicization of the care, but I think there's been something lost in when childcare is moved to a school-based setting, lost in terms of both kind of families and women in particular having input over and shaping care within the centers, and also seeing community-based childcare as a political project, as a feminist project, and as often as a socialist or a kind of progressive politics that's embedded in the provision of care in community-based settings. Not to romanticize it, but I think there's something lost when care has been early care has moved into the school system, and that kind of politics, that kind of more community-grounded progressive politics that was part of providing community-based care has been lost. So I think that's a tension that I need to kind of think through.
Next, we have Alana Powell with a question. If you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I just wanted to, if I can, add to or speak to the question that Meg just asked in the Ontario context, where I've been working to organize early childhood educators and been a part of the childcare movement. And one thing we've seen with early childhood education being taken up by public school systems, in particular, for example, the creation of full-day kindergarten, which created, put early childhood educators in the public school system, was that we saw that did have this incredibly devastating impact on community-based childcare programs, who similarly to, you spoke, Simon, about home childcare providers in New York, then lost children and capacity to the public school system. And we're seeing now that that's finally started to level out. But it's a tension that continues to exist, and certainly people think that it's a natural extension to bring early childhood education into the fold of public education. But I agree that then we also lose a lot of opportunity to be responsive to communities and in particular, and nuances at the local level and how we respond to children and families' needs. And I almost suspect, and and we talk a lot in our organization and in the work we do, that there doesn't maybe necessarily have to be this tension, that there could be an alternative way where we're talking about a public system, that it doesn't have to be socialized or institutionalized care, but there's ways to be locally responsive and have opportunities within the public school system. But even if we look at structural capacity, I mean, where are the spaces and places that we can bring more children into public schools? There just isn't that, even in many communities. I live in rural Ottawa, and there's nowhere in my village where you would create those opportunities. So there's got to be a way to build a public system of care that's more responsive than either or, I think. So, thanks. I just thought I'd add.
No, thanks, Elena. I can only just agree. I think you're right that there's it can't be an either or, and you know, I don't think I think those tensions that we see. I mean, when you rapidly introduce, like they did in New York City, to the credit of the mayoral administration of Bill de Blasio, when they rapidly rolled out early learning or pre-K for 4-year-olds, there wasn't a consideration to the financial impact that was going to have on community-based care. And you know, that community-based care had been something that was struggled over and fought for, both in terms of, you know, struggle over funding and also kind of struggle over control. That communities, and particularly, you know, Black and Latino communities, Puerto Rican communities, would have control over curriculums, some say, a way to shape that care in ways that they don't feel when it's shifted to the public school system. They don't feel that the public school system, which in New York actually has a very troubled history when it comes to questions of race, because the teaching staff, public school teachers in the New York public system, have been kind of disproportionately white. Yet community-based control, and you know, community-based childcare, community-controlled childcare, the teachers, the early childhood educators, are more reflective of the communities that they're actually serving, right? So I think there's interesting tensions there, and I don't think in New York City that the way it was done, although it, you know, we should welcome it, to think that the state is actually socializing, you know, social reproduction in a way, investing in early childhood care, that I don't think it was done in a way that was sensitive to the needs of working class racialized communities in particular.
There was a question from Mabel Arellano, and she's interested in your thoughts about the implications of online learning and what that means in terms of social reproduction. It's of course a huge question, so I don't know if you have thoughts that stem directly from your research on the book, and I think that will probably be the last question, so you can maybe answer it in any last words before we invite people to go home and read your book once more.
Oh God, Maple, I think we probably all maybe answer that in different ways. I don't know. I think teaching from home, trying to teach from home this semester, I was saying to my students, especially during lockdown at the end of the winter semester, when we entered lockdown through February or March, and that semester was ending, and I was teaching in my social justice, 4th year social justice class, you know, teaching about the care crisis, while I had a 2-year-old who should have been in daycare, but whose daycare was shut down, at home, you know, walking around in behind me. And I think that, you know, that kind of, that, not to be flippant about it, but the care crisis experienced at home definitely impacted my ability to teach about the care crisis to my students. So yeah, online learning, social reproduction. No, there's going to be dissertations and master's theses that are going to be coming down the pipeline fast and furious, I bet you. I think if people have the time to write and research on this, and I'm as interested as I think everybody on this call would be in thinking these things through, and what it means to resist in this context too.
And I'd just like to give maybe Idil the last word, but to say thank you very much to Dr. Tiffany Pollock for all the organizing around this. Thank you very much to Meg Luxton for the introduction. Thank you so much, Simon, for sharing your book with us. It's kind of fascinating, terrifying, and informative for the moment that we're living in right now. Just to remind people that the title of your book is Social Reproduction in the City, Welfare Reform, Childcare, and Resistance in Neoliberal New York. I did order it for the York University Library System, so any of you that are interested can now access it electronically through that system. And just for final thoughts or a few words, I turn it to Idil, and then thank you to everyone for coming. We're so grateful. I think it shows the interest and importance of Simon's book and his work, and of course, more broadly around the critical work that needs to be done on social reproduction and feminist political economy. So thank you for having this conversation. Idil, over to you for last words, last thoughts.
Yes, again, thank you to everybody at the center for having me here. Simon, thank you. Both, obviously, again, another plug. Here's the book. In case you don't have it, this is it. I feel like a YouTuber, you know, when the YouTube shows the stuff on YouTube. Anyway, so I just really want to point people, I think someone said it earlier, that they had to rewrite a part of their dissertation because Simon did such a good job in the book. I am that person as well. I particularly want to point folks to the book who want to think critically both about city and neoliberalism, folks who really want to think alongside Simon around how sort of labor, women, race, again, show up as alibis, policy, and also sort of thinking through it from a policy analysis perspective as well, which is really helpful for me, which I think many people may have not thought through it in that particular way. So thank you, Simon. Thanks for your generosity. And again, thanks for having us. Please read the book. And just because I'm also in the last stages of writing my dissertation, I also think if you are, it is really a good book to kind of, I think, help to think through how to also write a really piece of interesting and important critical work. I really appreciate the way you wrote it, Simon. So thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Idil. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, everybody who's showed up. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you all for your generous engagement with the work. I really appreciate it. Much love to all. Thanks.